I was born on November 21st, 1922, in Walldorf, Germany. Walldorf is a small village near the town of Meiningen in Thuringia, which is near the better-known town of Weimar. It is just south of Weimar. My childhood was very, very pleasant. My father was principal of a school. My mother and my father had a devoted marriage. I had one brother, older than I, and I grew up in that village. Went to primary school there, and did all the things that small children and little boys do, including using a roller skater on a steep hill and scaring my mother out of her skull with my daring do. This was a hill in the village. On the top of the hill there was an old medieval church. The countryside is hilly, not mountainous, but a very beautiful region where my family and I did a good deal of hiking on weekends, and it's a very, very pleasant countryside, rural at that time. Well, you ask a very interesting question, and the short answer is that I was no longer able to go to school because the Hitler Jugend would beat me up after school, and so it became clear that if I wanted to survive, I would have to leave. Fortunately, I had relatives in Little Rock, Arkansas, who took me into their home, and that is there's an interesting sidelight connected with that. My uncle was a personal friend of Senator Joseph Taylor Robinson, who was majority leader of the Senate during the first Roosevelt administration, and helped to pass, for example, the Glass-Steagall Act and many other important pieces of legislation. And my uncle had approached him in my behalf, and he wrote a letter to the American ambassador in Berlin. So when I arrived there in the summer of 1937 to pick up my visa, they rolled out the red carpet for me. I was a 14-year-old unimportant person. And I came to this country, went to high school in Little Rock, and then my parents were also able to get a visa and left in early 1939, just before war was declared in Europe, and we reunited in Chicago. And so I've been in Chicago ever since. How did I get on the Manhattan Project? I began be a student at Northwestern University in 1941, just before Pearl Harbor. And it was the policy of the United States government, enunciated in fact by President Franklin Delano Roosevelt, that they recognized that this war would depend on America's industrial might and would require the best scientific and engineering talent that would be available, and so encouraged students who were within a couple of years of graduation to continue their studies. So I was able to continue studying science, chemistry, physics at Northwestern, and received a baccalaureate degree cum laude in 1944. I was supposed to go to work at the metallurgical laboratories on the campus of the University of Chicago, which was part of the Manhattan Project. But in 1944, the Met Labs, as they were called, had already achieved their primary objectives. The first one, under the leadership of Enrico Fermi, was to build the first self-sustaining chain reaction, and that was done in 1942. And the second objective was to develop a separations process for the separation of plutonium that had been discovered in 1940 by Glenn Seaborg at Berkeley, to develop a separations process that could be scaled up to be used at Hanford for kilogram quantity separation of plutonium. That too had been accomplished by about 1943. So when I had finished my studies, the Met Labs were not in need of manpower anymore. So I was asked to go to Oak Ridge to work on the uranium project. And I did that. I got on a train, went from Chicago to Knoxville, and then took a bus to Oak Ridge in September of 1944. That's how I got on the Manhattan Project. At Northwestern, as far as I know, I was the only one to go on the Manhattan Project. My mentor, Professor Irving Klotz, was a consultant to the Manhattan Project, but he did important war work on biological materials at Northwestern. As far as I know, I'm the only one who actually went to work on the Manhattan Project from Northwestern. Yeah. Mm-hmm. When I got to Oak Ridge, I said that I wanted to be in the research division rather than in the engineering aspects of the work. And so I was assigned to work with a man who later actually became director of the Oak Ridge National Laboratory, but when I worked for him, He was director of the chemistry part of the research program at Oak Ridge. And I went into his office, and he went to a safe. He opened the safe and pulled out a handbook of physics and chemistry. And he opened it up to a table of the elements and pointed to uranium, and he said, "This is what we're working on." Well, uranium had a code name, which had been invented by the British. It was called tube alloy, because the uranium that was produced in Great Britain was produced by the tube alloy company. So the code name for, we were not allowed to use uranium in our conversation about the work we were doing. It was tube alloy. And I have reports that I wrote in those days with tube alloy in the title. So that's what I was working on. No, not Eugene Wigner. I did not know Wigner, no. Eugene Wigner was a theorist, he was a famous mathematician. I met him many years later, actually, on a visit to Israel. It turned out that he and I were both visiting Beersheba University and were staying at the same hotel, and we knew each other just very, very casually, but that was my only contact with Eugene Wigner. Yeah. In the chemistry parts of the project, in several different areas of the chemical aspects of that project. For example, the ion beams in the calutrons of uranium ions began as uranium tetrachloride. And we developed processes for the synthesis of large quantities of very pure uranium tetrachloride. These were encapsulated and heated, and then the vapor of uranium tetrachloride was ionized by energetic electron and particle beams to make uranium ion beams that were then separated into uranium-235 and uranium-238. So then it became another chemical project to separate the uranium from the graphite collectors. At the ends of the mass spectrometers, there were collectors made of graphite into which the uranium ions were injected. And about the only way you could recover the uranium was to burn the graphite in oxygen. And then you're left with uranium oxide. So one of the tasks that I was given was to synthesize an indicator, a colored dye that would be stable in very concentrated nitric acid. And the reason for this is that in the final stages of separation, uranium oxide was dissolved, or uranium peroxide was dissolved in nitric acid, and then extracted. The uranium nitrate was extracted into an organic solvent, and one had to determine in these columns the interface between the aqueous phase and the organic phase. And so I succeeded in producing an entirely new material, sulfonated copper phthalocyanine, which very, very brilliantly blue-colored material. 1 microgram was sufficient to color a liter of solution, and it was perfectly stable in nitric acid solution. So I did a number of different projects. Most people don't think about chemical problems related to the separation of uranium isotopes in calutrons. It's a physical thing. But it turns out that there were a number of important chemical problems that had to be resolved. So when I got to Oak Ridge in September of 1944, the place was in an uproar because the calutron magnets had burned out. There was a short that developed in the magnets, and they had to be shipped back to Alice Chalmers. And so the project was delayed. The production was delayed. But when I arrived, those magnets were back, and calutrons had been reassembled, and there were the alpha and the beta process, and we made kilogram quantities of uranium-235 between September of 1944 and about April or May of 1945. And this was shipped to Los Alamos, found its way into what became the Hiroshima bomb. It was a uranium bomb, which had never been tested. In fact, Hiroshima was the test for that first atomic bomb. The Nagasaki bomb was a plutonium bomb, which had been tested in Alamogordo. But the uranium bomb had never been tested. So, yeah. That was the end result of our labors. These reports that I wrote were declassified, and I was able to get them many years later from Oak Ridge. And if you were interested, I can make those available to you. Yeah, well, there was some chemistry involved in doing all of this. That's one of the untold parts of the story. My group leaders said that we need such a thing, and I went by bus from Oak Ridge to Knoxville several times to the University of Knoxville library. And I, as an undergraduate, had synthesized in an organic chemistry lab copper phthalocyanine. That was one of the experiments that we had done in a chemistry lab, an organic chemistry lab. And so I had the idea that if one could attach certain hydrophilic groups to this molecule, it should be possible to make it water soluble. And there were hints in the literature that this could be done using fuming sulfuric acid and so on. So I went into the lab and I tried it, and it worked. So that was how it came to be. I did it on my own without guidance. This was a good thing. It was used at Oak Ridge, and the people who had this problem were pretty happy with the result. It enabled them, if you have two liquids in touch with each other, and they're colorless liquids. You can't tell where one ends and the other begins. So if I put a dye in one of the liquids, then it's very clear where the interface is. So if you're extracting something from one liquid into the other liquid, then you want to know where that separation occurs so that you can make the actual separation. It's just a visual way of, a visual sensor of the interface of the two liquids. Oh, the whole thing was innovation. I mean, the calutrons had been invented by Ernest Orlando Lawrence, who had gotten the Nobel Prize for inventing the cyclotron. And he was one of the great scientists, and Glenn Seaborg, whom I got to know later and we became very good friends, was one of the great scientists and a man who influenced my life in a very profound way. These were great men, yes. They did lots of innovation. An amazing generation of scientists. Yeah. Well, in my experience, I'm just talking very subjectively, that kind of empowerment comes from the individual very largely. You either have it or you don't. I mean, you can't make somebody do something new. And a scientist is a man or a woman who does or says something new. And that, not everyone can do that. I don't know how you can encourage people to work and to study, but to get real innovation is, it's a good question. I mean, I don't know how to answer it really. Well, it's a new field, of course. It was a totally new field, and it unleashed a tremendous scientific effort and scientific creativity. But if you have an environment in which you tell people there's a certain goal we want to achieve, and we'll give you the resources to do it, and the manpower, then you can get a lot accomplished, particularly if you don't insist that every experiment has to be written according to a certain safety standard. Every chemical has to be indexed, and you need materials science data sheet, safety sheets, and I'm all in favor of safety. I've never had a laboratory accident, but the emphasis that is put on safety today, I think, exceeds what is required to do laboratory, and has gotten to the point where it inhibits laboratory work. I think. It's just my opinion. I'm not advocating unsafe practices by any means. I've always been conscious of safety, but I think today that aspect is a little overdone. Mm-hmm. If we had had to do that in those days, we couldn't have achieved what we did in a short period of time. I knew that it was going to be used for an atomic bomb, but the work that was done at Los Alamos, I knew nothing about. I knew nothing about bomb design or any of the problems associated with nuclear weapons. We knew what we had to do in order to make kilogram quantities of uranium-235, and that was about the extent of our knowledge about the project. We certainly didn't have an overall grasp of what was going on. Figured it out on our own. No one told us. No one talked about it. It was just in conversations with colleagues and on long hikes through the Smokies, wondering what we were doing and why we were doing it. We had to come to certain conclusions, but on our own. Yeah, there was no discussion from management about what was going on. No. Before the bomb was dropped? Yeah. No. That's the short answer. I did not think about it, and none of my colleagues, at least none that I spoke with, talked about it. So, the atmosphere at Oak Ridge was, we were under pressure to get something done, and my personal feeling was that we have to win the war for obvious reasons, but the consequences of what we were doing, that is something that I thought about only after the bomb was dropped. And then I became very involved in that after the war, yeah. Yes, after the Hiroshima and Nagasaki bombs were dropped, and the war was over, it's very hard to reconstruct the feeling that existed in this country about atomic work. I mean, people talked about atoms as if that was something totally new and totally unexpected and mysterious and secret. You talk to a person on the street about atoms, and you know, they were all dither. It's very hard to reconstruct the intense feeling that people had from one day to the next about atoms and atomic science. And one of the messages that we had was that there are no secrets about atoms, and that there's no defense against atomic weapons. And so we started an organization called the Oak Ridge Engineers and Scientists. And we wanted to create public awareness of what urgency there is in preventing anything like this from happening again. So together with two colleagues, John Balderston and David Waymeyer, we sent a letter to more than 100 of the outstanding personalities of the time. People who had been involved in the bomb project, like James Bryan Conant and others, and to scientists, including Albert Einstein. And in that letter we raised the question, what would have to be done to prevent nuclear weapons to be used in war? And we received replies to almost every letter that we had sent out, very thoughtful replies, and I still have those. And there was one from Albert Einstein in which he said the only solution would be a world government. We're still waiting for that. But one of the things that I did was I followed very closely the hearings that were taking place on Capitol Hill on the McMahon Act that advocated civilian control, and the May Act in the House that advocated military control. And there were people in our organization, I don't know how this happened, but we were able to get, at the conclusion of every day's hearings on these bills, we got the transcripts of those hearings that night. And I stayed up for hours condensing these into a newspaper article. And the following day I would drive to Knoxville and deliver that to the Knoxville Journal, and they printed it the following day. The summaries of these hearings. Well, the McMahon bill, I think, actually established the national labs. I think the national were established as a result of the passage of the McMahon Act. And so, in a way, I mean, my entire life has been involved with Argonne National Laboratory. So, I guess the Manhattan Project was a really very formative experience for me. It led to the place where I did all of the work that I continued for so many years. Argonne was established in April of 1946. And I went back to Chicago from Oak Ridge. I left Oak Ridge in April of 1946. And I went back to Northwestern to start graduate work with my former mentor. And I was doing that when I was approached to join Argonne. But I wanted to finish what I had started, and I left after a year. I got a master's degree from Northwestern and went to work at Argonne. And it was possible for me to continue graduate work at the University of Chicago. While I was working at Argonne, I did my dissertation on the magnetic susceptibilities of neptunium compounds. That's element 93. And I got to know Glenn Seaborg at that time. He made frequent visits to Argonne and was very interested in my work because I was able to show in very great detail that Seaborg's actinide hypothesis was the correct picture for the electronic structure of the actinides. So that was a very fruitful period, and I worked at Argonne on again chemical problems associated with the building of a nuclear submarine. Argonne became the national center for the development of nuclear reactors, power reactors, for peaceful uses of atomic energy. So Argonne was established as the center for the development of power reactors. And the first power reactor actually was Rickover's nuclear submarine reactor. And there was a very, very important chemical problem that had to be solved for that reactor to work. Well, that problem was that the zirconium cladding of the uranium fuel elements for the submarine reactor, the zirconium, when it is mined, always contains 10 or 15% of hafnium. And hafnium had been found to have a very high neutron capture cross-section. So in order for zirconium to be used as a cladding, hafnium had to be removed. And so I developed a process that was actually put into pilot plant. There was a pilot plant constructed to do it by Foot Mineral to remove hafnium from zirconium. And then the zirconium, very resistant to corrosion, was a very, and it still is, a very useful cladding material for uranium. But all of the zirconium that is used does not contain any hafnium. So there had to be chemical processes to remove the hafnium, which is chemically very similar to zirconium. So it's not an easy thing. The Germans did not realize that all graphite contains boron. And yes, you're right. Yeah, that's absolutely right. Fermi and Szilard did recognize that, and so they were able to get the manufacturers of the graphite used in Chicago to be boron-free. And there's a story that when the truck arrived with the graphite blocks to build the reactor, Fermi himself unloaded them. There was a very famous lady involved in the early work. She was a very close associate of Leona Woods, was a close associate of Enrico Fermi. And when I was a graduate student at the university, Leona Woods and Enrico Fermi came walking into our lab one time because my mentor there was using a new technique of spin resonance spectroscopy, and Fermi wanted to know, how does this work? So he looked around for about 5 minutes and said, oh, I see. Well, Fermi, unfortunately, of course, he passed away in 1954, cancer. But when I was a student there, and starting in 1947 and 1948, our apartment was on 53rd Street and University Avenue, and Fermi would ride his bike past our apartment every morning at 8 o'clock, and I would look out my window and see him, and it was time to get up and get dressed and go and listen to his lecture. He was a professor at the university after the war until he died. Oh, he was the most marvelous teacher. I mean, I'd listened to his lecture and understood everything he said until I left the room. Great lecture. And a great teacher. He would have lunch with his undergraduates every day in the Commons. You'd see him there talking to students. Yeah. Well, those were great days at the University of Chicago. You had Edward Teller there as a professor, and Harold Urey, and Willard Libby. Well, Leona finally married Willard Libby. I didn't know him personally. He lived very close to where we were, but I didn't know him. I used to see him, but I didn't know him personally. Like, I don't really know very much about his personality, except what I found out from other people who did know him. I have met Salar. I met him, but I didn't really know him. I knew Urey quite well. He was actually my graduate advisor at the university, Harold Urey. And Libby, I knew. Well, I lived in a dormitory with construction workers of K-25. K-25 had not been completed, it was just being built when I arrived there. And that was quite an experience. West Village 54, I think it was called. It was sort of on the outskirts of town. Right. That's where it was located. But we had a very interesting group of young scientists there. And several of us became sort of addicted to the Smokies. We would go whenever we had a chance. And that was, the park was dedicated by President Roosevelt in 1937, I believe, and we were there. Just a few years later, when it was not the tourist attraction it is now, in fact, there's a place called Cades Cove, which is a valley surrounded by hills that housed a community of early English settlers, and they still spoke sort of Elizabethan speech. They had been isolated for 100 years. They still a functioning community with a church and a school and a mill, and they had not yet been evicted, even though that was part of the Great Smoky Mountain National Park. They were still there, sort of at the tail end. So that was, fascinating experience. For me, and on these hikes, we talked about every subject under the sun. So it was it's a very, as I said before, a very formative period in many ways. Yes, I was single. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, there were a lot of, many of the people there were married. Fortunately, they invited me over for dinner. That was good. The number of uncommitted ladies is not that large, no. It's not such a large number of girls around. But food was horrible. There was nothing to drink. It was dry. You had to go to Corbin, Kentucky, to get some liquor. The Oak Ridge was dry. But the Calutrons were manned by women. But these were mostly high school girls, totally untrained, and they manned the control panels, and they did a good job in doing that. So even though you were uneducated, they were very faithful workers. Yeah, in what I was doing, the research part of the lab, we had just normal, 8 to 5 kind of hours, and we didn't burn the midnight oil. I was not that kind of environment. I mean, we worked during the day, and then we had free time in the evening and on weekends, so it was a normal kind of work situation. It was intense, but not frenetic. It wasn't that kind of thing. I met my wife in the fall of 1947. We were both graduate students at the University of Chicago. She was in psychology, and I was in science, and that's how we met. Well, after she got her degree, she became director of psychological services in our school system in the suburb of Chicago. So she had a career there. And then later she went into private practice, and she was in private practice for about 20 years. My work at Argonne was strongly influenced by my experiences on the Manhattan Project. And in reflecting back on what I did during most of my life, I would have to say that my scientific work had its origins in the realization that nuclear power was something really new and important, and that there were two sides to it, one destructive and the other constructive, that power could be used as a non-polluting alternative source of energy. So for the rest of my scientific life, I devoted myself to the solution of this very daunting and challenging problem of how to create a sustainable, non-polluting, global energy source. And over the years, that has become a very, very important and a very, very pressing problem, because we are now in a situation where are polluting the planet with greenhouse gases could lead to making the planet uninhabitable. And so it is absolutely essential, if we are to continue living a civilized life that requires a lot of energy, and there are 7 billion of us now, that we do whatever we can, and as quickly as possible, to find that new energy source. And so I spent many, many years studying nuclear fission reactors, power reactors. I was a U.S. delegate at the second International Conference on Peaceful Uses of Atomic Energy. It took place in Geneva, Switzerland. I have maintained that interest and all my life, and later on began to be interested in problems associated with the practical use of fusion energy, and did a lot of fundamental work associated with problems that are encountered when you try to operate plasma machines like tokamaks that would produce power. So it became clear as the years went on, and worldwide efforts were mounted both for fission reactors and for fusion reactors, that to find such a alternative source is maybe the most challenging task that faces science today, science and technology. Extremely challenging. And I have finally come to the conclusion that because of the problems that are encountered with fission reactors, Chernobyl, 3 Mile Island, Fukushima, that there are problems associated not only with operating these machines, but also with storing of these vast amounts of radioactivity, long-lived products that are produced, that in this country there has been no nuclear reactor built in 40 years. And you have to ask yourself why that is. Fusion reactors have been under serious development for over 50 years now, and none have achieved break-even conditions. Break-even means that you get as much energy out as you put in. That is, to get a plasma, a self-sustaining plasma that gives you back as much energy as you put in to make the plasma. That has not yet been achieved in any of these machines. And that's only the beginning. And it is not clear, at least it's not clear to me, that fusion reactors, power reactors, can be built. Basically, what you're trying to do is to produce conditions that exist in the sun here on Earth. So I have come to the conclusion that we do have an alternative energy source available to us, and that is the sun. It has been there forever. It has given us life. It nourishes us today. It gives us it has produced all of the fossil fuels that we're now burning up very, very quickly. It took 100 or more million years to produce them, and we're burning it up in a couple of hundred years. And So the sun has been around, the sun will be around, and we have to learn how to use it more efficiently in order for solar power to be able to compete with fossil fuel or nuclear power. And in my opinion, the large-scale use of solar power depends on making it cheaper, on making it economically competitive with the conventional, let's say, coal-fired power plants. So I'm spending my retirement years in developing a new approach to using solar power more efficiently, to make it twice as efficient. That is, to make the conversion of light to electricity twice as efficient as it is now, to double the power from sunshine. That is what I'm working on. And if I trace the connections of that interest back, then I end up with the Manhattan Project. So I think there is a direct connection between what I'm doing now and what I did all those many years ago. That's kind of amusing. Yes, I hope so too. Well, I mean, it's a difficult situation for someone in my position. There is such competition for funding these days to get something done, to do, to set up experiments to follow these ideas at my age is not an easy task. I have no problem finding graduate students or postdoctoral students or faculty members or people at a national laboratory to work on this problem if I could pay them. They'd be glad to work on it, but first they have to support their families before they can do this. And I find that is something that has changed in a fundamental way. That's my perception, that today people are focused on short-term gain. I mean, it used to be much easier to get funding. I have a feeling from what you said earlier that it's not so easy to get funding for what you're involved in either. Get people excited about a project that they don't see an immediate financial gain is a difficult thing. It used to be easier, I think. At least there was a period after World War II when science was being supported at a much higher level than it is today. And I'm concerned that this country, by not focusing more on basic scientific research, is going to fall behind. I hope I'm wrong, but I don't know. The Vannevar Bush used to say, "Science, the endless frontier." And I think he was right, and it's not going to stop. And if we don't push the envelope in this country, there are other people who are going to do it. and they will develop the technologies of the future. I think that's the inevitable result of the lack of concern in funding science. I don't know how to change that. I mean, people like me, and you say there are others, are in a unique position to contribute to, if there were a national debate about these issues, because we span a large fraction of what one might call the modern scientific and technological age. I mean, much of what has happened theoretically, and from quantum physics to cosmology to material science to nanoscience, all of this stuff has happened in the last 70 years. And when you have the kind of perspective that you can get when you've lived through it and been active in it all these years, you may be able to contribute something, but that resource is not being tapped. There's nobody who's ever asked me for an opinion about these matters. And I don't know whether I don't know how you view that from your perspective. I mean, the fact that you have to persuade people to support the project that you're involved in, that they don't immediately recognize this as a very important period in this country's history, a defining period, and to increase public awareness of where we are now compared to where we were then, and to gain some insight and wisdom from the way things have developed. I mean, people hold in their palms more computing power than existed for the astronauts on the moon. And they don't even think about the fact that when they use the smartphone, they have to recharge it every night, and you just plug it into the wall. But suppose the wall didn't recharge the battery. They don't make the connection between the energy you're using when you use the cell phone and the enormous amounts of power that are required to do all the computing that's done in the world today. If people talk blithely about the electric automobile, if we had 100 million electric automobiles in this country and you plug them all in at the same time, you'd blow the national fuse, right? But they're non-polluting, okay? And you don't make the connection to the power that is required in order to run these automobiles. So there's been an information technology revolution. What we need now, I think, is an energy technology revolution. And we have to think about how to bring that about. So your friends at the Department of Energy, I'm sure they want to do something, but they don't have the wherewithal. They keep cutting back on the budgets of the Department of Energy. That's my message for today. Scientific research is basically not being funded anymore because the industrial research labs, I read just the other day, General Electric has put $30 million into a company called Quirky. Quirky takes inventors' ideas and selects them very carefully and translates them into products. What I take away of General Electric is supporting a company that commercializes inventions that they should be making in their own labs. They must find it economically advantageous to outsource innovation and commercialization of innovation rather than doing it in-house. So that's what's happened in industrial research. Many companies that had research labs in the 50s and 60s have closed them down. They're not supporting basic research anymore. So I don't. I used to be on the editorial boards of Journal of Applied Physics and Applied Physics Letters, and they still invite me to the lunches. And the number of scientific manuscripts today coming out of China to these journals, American journals, is larger than the number of papers submitted by U.S. authors. I was in the heyday of science. Right. Yeah, I feel very fortunate to have experienced that, but I wish other people could too. And that's just the way it is. We need another Manhattan Project. I kid you not. We could do it. If we had another Manhattan Project for solar power, we could do it. We could make solar power economically competitive in 2 or 3 years. The technology that Iran is using, centrifuges, was just in its infancy during the Manhattan Project. It was just a very small effort. And that technology has come along to such an extent that it's now the way of making uranium-235. I doubt if there's anything in the Manhattan Project secret literature that would have any bearing on that, on centrifuge technology. But I don't know. I mean, I don't know. There could be, but I doubt it. So they're going to get a nuclear weapon, that's for sure, if they don't already have it. There's a story that J. Robert Oppenheimer walked into Truman's office and said to him, "Mr. President, I have blood on my hands." And that's the last time Truman ever spoke to him. What choice did the commander-in-chief have at that moment in history except to authorize dropping the atomic bomb? He didn't have a choice. And as gruesome as it was, and as horrified as I and my colleagues were at that time, I feel today that it was the correct decision. It brought an end to the most horrible war. It saved millions of lives, American soldiers and Japanese soldiers. I mean, do I feel a personal responsibility? Of course. I took part in that. But was it the correct decision? I think so. I've talked to quite a few men who were in Europe, fighting in Europe. And at the end of the European War, they were loaded on boats, sent to New York, and transshipped to San Francisco. And they were on their way to Japan, to the invasion of Japan. And when the bombs were dropped, they were very happy that they didn't have to fight in the Pacific. I know several guys who were in that position. Yeah. But we must not let it happen again. And if Iran gets the bomb and drops it on Israel, that will be World War III, and that'll be the end of all of us. That's my feeling. Well, the fear, of course, was that Germany would get the bomb first because fission had been discovered at the Kaiser Wilhelm Institute in 1938. So everybody thought that if anybody gets the bomb, it would be Germany. And the fact that you now have almost a dozen nations that have nuclear weapons shows that if a technology is possible and has been demonstrated, it will be replicated. There's no way of stopping it. And so if the United States had not done it, instead of what started 5 years, it would have taken 10 or 15 years, but by now we would have a nuclear-armed world anyway, even without the Manhattan Project. Don't you think so? I mean, a nuclear weapon is no harder to make than a smartphone. I've been out to the Intel plant. I have seen how they make chips. That's a pretty sophisticated operation. It's at least as sophisticated as making an atomic bomb. It's a good question. We asked that question, as I told you, in 1945. And Albert Einstein told us that we need a world government. Well, we have got the genie out of the bottle and we can't put it back. Well, we've not had any leader crazy enough to pull the trigger. Yeah, you'd have to be insane to do it. I shudder to think what would happen if terrorists got a hold of it.